Conceptually speaking, fun is incredibly subjective. I really enjoy Pokemon as a franchise, but I wouldn't announce that to a large group of people because I'd be stoned to death. However, I still believe there's an objectivity to what is and isn't fun, a sort of quantifiable nature that can be applied to games to justify my unquestionable will. To illustrate, I'm going to talk about two games. The first is Dead by Daylight, a game in which survivors have to complete tasks to escape from a killer while trying to stay hidden. The other is Friday the 13th, a game in which survivors have to complete tasks to escape from a killer while trying to stay hidden. I chose these two games because they both attempt to execute very similar concepts, but I only consider one to be quote-unquote fun. Dead by Daylight is better than Friday the 13th, and this is why. It should be noted that I'm by no means saying that Friday the 13th is a bad game, or that Dead by Daylight is a good game. They are both bad games. However, much like a film, enjoyment and quality are separate metrics. I can see Dead by Daylight's flaws and still appreciate where it succeeds. The way the games work is that a certain amount of players play as survivors, while one plays as the killer, and each group has their own conflicting objectives. A typical game involves players taking steps towards escaping, while the killer tries to kill every survivor before this can happen. However, there are multiple slight mechanical differences that differentiate the two games, and have a big impact on player psychology. Firstly, progression in Dead by Daylight is quantifiable. Your only means of escape is by powering on 5 generators, an achingly slow process in itself, after which 2 exit gates are powered up. Both the killer and survivors know how many generators they have left to power. In Friday the 13th, on the other hand, your options as a survivor are less limited. You can call the police, escape by vehicle, even kill Jason, or simply wait out the clock, which can take around 20 minutes. While this freedom of choice might appear like a good thing, I would argue it's actually detrimental to the gameplay. A lack of unified purpose in the game means that players can often all end up working towards completely different goals. Although you all share a common enemy, the collaboration often doesn't go further than this. This creates an environment in which the player doesn't feel like they're working towards a goal and is instead just passing time until the end of the match. When I play it, I don't feel like my actions are impacting upon the games at all. In his book, Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi conceptualizes the idea of flow as being completely involved in an activity for its own sake. In other words, it's a level of involvement in an activity in which nothing else seems to matter, the optimal state of intrinsic motivation. It's more commonly referred to as being in the zone. Friday the 13th's gameplay is antithetical to flow. Since the player has to actively go out of their way to work with the other players, and is often discouraged from doing so by the game design, flow becomes impossible to achieve. The player can oftentimes just end up hiding and waiting for the game to end so they can achieve the arbitrary "you win" sticker. Dead by Daylight, on the other hand, encourages flow through a number of subtle differences. Firstly, the single goal not only allows for cooperation, but forces it. All survivors share the same goal, so even when being chased by the killer, one still has the feeling like they're somehow helping by distracting the killer from the other survivors. The fact that progress is quantifiable through how many generators are left to repair also helps add to tension, which is a pretty important part of a horror game. I've never felt any sort of tension playing Friday the 13th, and this is in large part due to the lack of flow from not having clear objectives. Another way in which Dead by Daylight achieves flow is through the smaller number of survivors and the smaller maps. In Friday the 13th, a typical game will have 7 survivors, whereas DBD only has a maximum of 4 survivors. This makes for much more tense gameplay, since via the whole safety in numbers concept, you're statistically more vulnerable to the killer. Coupled with the smaller map, a player is more likely to encounter the killer and have to run or hide from them. In contrast to Friday the 13th's often aimless gameplay, this gives the player almost too much to worry about. The game becomes a juggling act between having to repair generators before your teammates are killed or you're discovered, and I've spent games in which I've been unable to even work on a generator because I've been chased by the killer the whole game. Another factor that makes Dead by Daylight more fun is the hook system, which gives the players a delay between being caught and being killed, leaving a window for other survivors to save you and adding a whole other element to gameplay. There's also the wide selection of killers that all have their own powers and individual perks, a far cry from the killers in Friday the 13th, which are all just variations on the Jason character that are almost entirely cosmetic choices. At the start of a DBD game, one of the most important things to do is determine which killer you're playing against, as this shapes how the survivors should play, therefore adding even more variety to the gameplay. In essence, the key difference between the two games is the flow that one game creates while the other does not, and the difference that focused gameplay can have on a player.